Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first chapter of the book of Job. The book of Job is the earliest chronologically written book of the Old Testament. So whoever wrote it, and we don't know who wrote it before Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, etc., the whole Torah or Pentateuch. And so it may have been after the time the human protagonist lives, but the historicity of the human protagonist is attested to by in both Ezekiel in 14:14 and 20, and James in James 5:11. He endured for the generations beyond them as a model of patience in the midst of persecution. And the genre that Job belongs to is known as theodicy. It explores the relationship of suffering to the righteous. And there's really no other book quite like it in the Bible. The closest equivalent that really explores it, not as extensively, but would probably be First Peter. But this was nothing new or original in the ancient Near East. Every culture had their own work of literature explaining this topic. Why do the righteous suffer? And why are they accursed by what the neighbors of the Hebrew people, Job was actually not a Hebrew, we'll touch on that later, thought were curses of the gods, and even the so Job, we're just going to take it from the opening verse. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and straight, and one who feared Elohim, and turned away from evil. So Uz would have been in what would eventually become Edomite territory, which was west of the Jordan, occupied by the descendants of Isaac's eldest firstborn son, Esau. The Jewish people came about through the younger born twin, Jacob, clutching them. So Job was not a Hebrew man. Whoever he was, he had a relationship with the God of Israel without being quite an Israelite. And his name Job is also referenced in Genesis 46:13, but that would have been one who dwelled in Egypt. So when Job took place was likely during the time of the patriarchs. When it was written, it was sometime between that and Moses. But this Job we read was perfect and straight. That means he had integrity, he had completion, he was out without guile or hypocrisy. And the integrity of his faith is the one thing his integrity and his faith is the one thing he maintains when he loses everything else. We read part of what he loses in the first chapter, and then it gets even worse in the second chapter. We might pick that one up on a later date. But he feared Elohim, the God of the Israelites, even though he wasn't an Israelite, and he resisted and turned away from evil. And I think eventually for an example of the dialogues which come after the first two chapters, he says, I have made a covenant with my eyes to not look on a woman with lust. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Numerous children would have been considered a blessing in the ancient Near East. So he had 7 sons and 3 daughters, large family. And his possessions were 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 female donkeys and a very large body of servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. So Job had no need, want, or lack for anything, material items. He was prosperous, and much of wisdom literature does connect piety to prosperity, such as we read in Solomon and witness in his life. But this, by the New Testament, the Savior says, it's easier for a camel to pass through the needle of an eye than it is for a rich man to enter into heaven. Nevertheless, what is impossible for man is possible for Elohim. So there is such a thing as someone who can live with great possessions without being possessed by them. Job had his priorities in order. He was incidentally successful materially, wealth-wise, because he was successful in his spiritual life. And his sons went and had a feast in the house of each on his day, and sent and invited their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So there's no hint of sibling rivalry in this family. They united as friends in easy harmony and coexistence. They celebrated each other's birthdays together, and they ate and drank and had a good, wholesome fun, we can imagine. But Job is concerned that is so concerned that one of them may have inadvertently sinned and not even know it, that he prepares a sacrifice for them. We'll read on that later. And it came to be, when the days of feasting had gone round, that Job would send and bless them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings, the number of them all. For Job said, "It might be that my sons have sinned and cursed Elohim in their hearts." This Job always did. So there's a consistency about this pattern. We read that the numerous numbers, he had 10 children, and each of them celebrated their birthdays. So this would have been a 10-time-a-year thing when they gathered and did what was just described. But on every occasion, he offered a sacrifice on the off chance that his sons and daughters who he had reared in righteousness, and as we read eventually, if not in this chapter, certainly the next, that these children are all taken from him. So even though he had cared for them and provided for them on their behalf, and it was not uncommon for the head of the family to act as the family priest before the writing of the law of Moses, his children are taken from him. But as we read in the 42nd chapter, what the possessions we just read of family and wealth in the 2nd and 3rd chapter, he ends up getting twofold of what he once had, but he has to go through the ringer before he gets the blessing of all that, let me tell you. And the days came to be that the sons of Elohim came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan also came among them. The sons of Elohim, in this context, because it's plural, it would not be the only begotten, it would have been the angels. These are heavenly and even demonic intermediaries between humanity and divinity. Those of Satan and the demons, who is mentioned here, have their own agenda and their own designs, but nevertheless they are summoned to the councils of heaven to listen to the Supreme One speak. And Yahweh said to Satan, "From where do you come?" And Satan answered Yahweh and said, "From diligently searching in the earth, and from walking up and down in it." So Satan's mission and his whole reason for existence is because his doom is already sealed, it's to bring as many humans down with him that he can. So he diligently searches the earth for souls to steal, and sends his demonic minions to influence and, if possible, penetrate them. This is his mission. This is his life activity. This is his purpose for being, as he sees it. And Yahweh said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a perfect and straight man, one who fears Elohim and turns away from evil?" So much of the virtues which were read in the opening verse are repeated here. This is how Yahweh sees him. So even if all of humanity is in moral decline, there's always a righteous remnant, and this righteous one was so beloved and esteemed by and noticed by Elohim, who is perfectly righteous, that he presents him as an example for one who is incorruptible to his diligent designs to Satan. And Satan answered Yahweh and said, Is Job fearing Elohim for naught? So he questions the reason why Job is fearing and worshiping the Almighty the way he is. And the answer that he comes up with, he asks and then answers his own question in the 10th verse, asks in the 9th, Have you not made a hedge around him, and around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the lands. So he's noticing that he's implicitly accusing Job of having a commercial sense of worship, which is somewhat alive and well in our own age through the prosperity gospel. No shortage of those. They have most of the television channels, while the authentic gospels do not have the television coverage that they do. But more to the point of the passage, he's saying that Job only worships him because his possessions are numerous and his fortress is impenetrable, and he has increased. So with that he adds, But stretch out your hand, please, and strike all that he has, if he would not curse you to your face. So he's giving him a challenge to take away everything, all his possessions, all his items, and he's going to curse you to your face. So he wants to prove he's disputing and challenging Yahweh's implicit, or Elohim's implicit notion that Job cannot be corrupted, and Satan is saying he can. Let me do all that I can do to him with your permission. Satan seldom operates outside of the permission of Elohim. He is a created creature, and as such has his own will and way, but a lot of times he is released by Elohim to chasten his people. And Yahweh said to Satan, See, all that he has is in your hands, only do not lay a hand on himself. And Satan went from the presence of Yahweh. So with almost immediately, without evidence of even thinking about it, but as an omniscient being, we have to know that he knew the question that was going to come before it came from all eternity. And so he actually consents to his nefarious suggestion. He's so sure and confident in his servant Job to remain uncorrupted by what Satan has to offer. The one restriction, because remember, Satan is operating under the permission of Elohim, and so this ultimately causes some confusion in the dialogues which proceeded in the 3rd through the 34th chapter, the human dialogues. They are not privy, the reader has the gift of hindsight. We're privy to this counsel and this dialogue in the heavens, which sets the stage for the series of dialogues and debates about why this happened. And all of them thought he was accursed of Elohim, when in fact he was accursed by Satan through Elohim's permission. And the day came when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their brother, the firstborn. And an angel came to Job and said, The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys feeding alongside them, when Sheba fell upon them and took them away, and they smote the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to inform you. So that's a lot of bad news to digest at once. Any item in that would be shocking. Just the loss of his agricultural animals were slain or stolen by Sabaean raiders. That's ultimately translated as Sabians, and killed the servants who were employed by Job to make sure that the farm animals did what they needed to do. But this one was spared, and he's telling him what he's telling him now. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Kastites, the Chaldeans, formed 3 bands, and I made a raid on the camels, and took them away, and they smote the servants with the edge of the swords. And I alone have escaped to inform you. So Chaldeans would have been nomadic people. They wouldn't have been a nation. Them and the Sabians lived on the outskirts of civilization as nomads, who raided civilization to take away some of the spoils of its fruits, and these Kastites did the same thing with the camels, different farm animal, but they took them all and killed the servants who were guarding them or entrusted to watch over them while they did what they did. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their brother, the firstborn. This takes us back to the 13th verse, so we understand this might have taken place on one of their birthdays, and the host of the siblings was the firstborn. So as the value of farm animals is monetary, the value of human lives is immeasurable. They are priceless treasures. So just the sequence, the succession in the intensity of the increasing intensity of their information is a lot to digest for one man who, before Satan did what he did at the permission of Elohim, was prospering fully, and he's witnessing his entire life being eroding before his very eyes at the sound of what these employees of his were informing him by. And see, a great wind came from the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young men, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to inform you. So Satan took full advantage of Elohim's offer just to not lay a hand on Job. So as Satan saw it, his family and his children were not off limits. His wife was spared, as we read, but the loss of one son or daughter is terrible enough. The loss of all 10 of them all at once from an inexplicable natural calamity, which collapsed the house they were in, which caved in and crushed them. And once more, there is one, the servants who come all say the same thing in their final sentence, and I alone have escaped to inform you. So this is a lot of bad news to digest. And how does Job react to this news? Well, we read in the 20th verse, then Job rose up and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and did obeisance. So this was the physical symbolisms of ritualistic mourning and grieving. He would have shaved his head to show his humility. That's an act of humility. And he falls to the ground not in grief, but in worship, although he is certainly grieving. He still feels this connection with Yahweh, and he tells him, and he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I return there. Yahweh has given, and Yahweh has taken away. Blessed be the name of Yahweh. So that's remarkable incorruptibility and integrity, to just have your entire life destroyed in a twinkle of an eye. All your years of working and laboring and accumulating and worshiping and doing the right thing taken from you in a twinkle of an eye. But to acknowledge that as he came, he entered into the world with nothing, and there is nothing he can bring. Any of us can bring to the next world. What we can do is leave the world a better place than the one we left, but that not everyone does that. But Job certainly did, and he acknowledges the prerogative and authority of the same Yahweh, whose grace and generosity gives human possessions to take them away. So his most treasured possession was clearly his relationship with Yahweh, who he blesses at the tail end of his prayer. He blesses the name of him. And in all this, Job did not sin, nor ascribe wickedness unto Elohim. So far, Job has passed the test. His initial reaction, which ultimately prompts and invites Satan for further attacks in the second chapter, we'll probably cover that one soon. So the entire reason he did it was to get Job to curse Elohim to his face, and he blesses rather than curses. So far he has frustrated his designs. A lot comes in the second chapter that's going to form the substance of the dialogues of the 3rd through 37th chapter. I may have said 34 earlier. It's actually the 37th. Elihu is the final human arguer. Then Yahweh dramatically enters in the scene in chapter 28, and in chapter 40 or 42 we read that Job is blessed twofold what he had before all this calamity visited on him, and he doesn't give Job demands his day in court throughout these trials between him and his friends, but Yahweh does not answer any of his questions. Instead, he asks him the questions, showing his utter incompetency to explain the laws of nature. So who are you to question my ethical plan and my moral order in my universe? After all, I made it. You are my creator, yet what you have spoken about me is correct, and what your friends spoke about me is wrong. So I'm going to bless you with twofold possessions. And what Job had spoken about was right, and what his friends were wrong we can read that through the 3rd through the 37th chapter. There's a lot of good stuff in Job's protagonist argument. They are clear. They seem to anticipate the book of Deuteronomy even before it was written, but they cling to an archaic theology that envisioned suffering as the righteous response to unrighteousness. So they accuse Job of having some sin hidden in his heart that he did not know or would not admit. But even though Job did not suffer because he sinned, he did sin in his suffering slightly. He becomes convinced of his own self-righteousness. These are ultimately topics for another debate or another day, but I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.